Okay, yes.
I know I have to leave for the end, so I would like to catch
Okay.
up later on. No, thanks.
Yes, I'll get this to you afterwards. It looks like it is recorded. Okay, are we ready to get started?
Yes.
Okay, so we're going to talk today about creating awesome user stories. So start out with that link that I pasted in there, or you can just type in what's up here at the top. Go and go to that and just put what in one word. I think you can use underscore instead of spaces and kind of get the words to work together. But what word best describes your role on the team? Leader, I like that. Guessing that problem solver word together, develop. So lots of developers, heavy on developer, analyst, BAs, architect, DBA, intern, problem solver. Okay, great. So we're skewing toward. Looks like most of us are kind of wearing the developer, analyst, BA hat. Some in that thing. Guy, what the one that had Guy? I'm curious what that one was. Problem Guy, was that it, or or just Guy? Maybe that was it. Okay, so that's kind of where we're distributing, at least at how we kind of see ourselves. So let's talk about user story. So user story is a way to represent work. And the idea behind it is to have a good way that we can all get behind, understand what things are supposed to mean, and prioritize them, make sure we're working on the thing that's more important than the thing that's less important. So when you hear the term stories, what does that mean to you? Like, how do you feel about that? We're going to write user stories. Does that sound like just a silly way to say requirements? A useful way to capture high-level details of real user needs? Too little information to really be useful? Usually doesn't represent much of what the user wants, or love and adoration, or loathing and hate. So these are all things I've heard people describe as their experience with the concept of user stories. And this is just how you feel. There's no, see the incognito thing here says we can't figure out who you are, and this is about how you feel about them, not necessarily how you think you're supposed to feel about them. So the silly way to say requirements, I think there's a lot of truth in that, and hopefully as we go through this today, we'll kind of look at some of the reasons that it might. Some of the reasons that stories may help us if we're using them correctly, that if we were just focused on requirements in the traditional sense, might not get us as much bang for our buck. Okay, so this group is mostly kind of in the group here of saying we're mostly seeing this as a useful way to capture requirements, which is great. That's not always the case, and that's not to discount anybody that's in this group of here seeing as too little information to be helpful. Doesn't represent how much really anything the user wants, or this is just a silly way to say the same thing that we're going to have to do either way. This slide, I'll bring this up every once in a while. If you think of a question that you want to ask, you can put it in here and we can rank it up and down. This helps make sure it doesn't get lost. And like I said, I can't really see the chat very well. So if there is something, feel free to throw it in there, or we just ask at the end. And also don't hesitate to interrupt me. We've got a small group here. We can have conversations as we go. Okay, so user stories. Well, a story is something that is fiction, right? A story is something starts out as fiction. It doesn't describe the way the world is. It describes the way we want the world to be, or a potential way the world could be. Whether or not that vision of the future will ever be manifest or not is to be determined. User stories usually answer a way that a lot of people have found to make them useful is to think of them in terms of who, what, and why. Now, there's nothing magical about this, but this is a good way to make sure that you're capturing. If we've got a user story that doesn't tell who it's for, doesn't tell what it is, or doesn't tell why we're doing it, we're probably leaving out information that's important. So you end up seeing a lot of things like this, where you've got these kind of almost. Has anyone here played Mad Gabs? Where like you've got all these blanks and you fill it in with a noun, and so that's kind of how I think of this, just a little bit. So this type of format, that's who. I want to, this is what we're trying to do with it, so I can, and there's the why. So there's nothing you can come up with anything you want. The advantage of having some type of format like this is they all tend to be structured together, and it kind of keeps you from getting in writer's block of how do I go ahead and represent what I want. It's like, okay, this is for this type of user. Okay, fill that in. What are they wanting to do? If I'm the user, what would I want to do here? And you can fill that in. And then why are they wanting to do this? So these can be really, really useful. But I think it's important not to think of this as you have to represent a user story like this. You represent them in a number of different ways, but this is a way that can be helpful. A lot of teams have found this helpful. There's other little formats out there. If you find you want to add something else, that is great. You know, this is to serve your needs. You're not trying to serve its needs. Okay, so if we think of our fiction, we want to say, how will the world be better? So let's look at a potential user story. As a cow, I want to be milked so I can be comfortable. This is a very real user story. So if you've been around cows, this is something they want. They want this experience. If they haven't been milked, they're uncomfortable and they start bellowing and stuff because they need help. So another user story, kind of in the same vein. As a dairy farmer, I want cows milked on demand so I can maximize production. So these two stories are very simple stories. There's not a lot of details in here. There's not a lot of requirements about everything that could possibly be done. But here's an embodiment of that user story. This is a robotic milking machine. My friend who lives here nearby has one of these, 2 or 3 of these, I think. He put them in about 5-10 years ago. And you can... I actually had videos of it working and it was very cool, I thought, but then I realized for a lot of people that hadn't been exposed to like how their food is made, they may not want all the details. But it's got like these scanners on it and it cleans the udder and scans them to figure out where they are and attaches everything and milks the cow. The cows love it because anytime they get uncomfortable, they just walk into this thing. It recognizes the cow. It feeds them based on exactly what they need, giving them any medicine that they may need as part of it. It milks the cow. The milk goes through the processing stuff into the tanks, and the cow walks out the other end. So, I mean, this is an incredible thing. And those user stories actually represent the very big high-level idea of what this thing does. And my friend who's the dairy farmer has told me multiple times, like he put in this big thing in his field that just when a cow comes up to it, it spins kind of like a car wash, and they can rub their back on it, and it makes them feel really good. I was like, is that worth investing in? And he said, absolutely, because when my cows are happy, they make more milk. So this is another way for him to make his cows happy to get more milk. Anyway, but those user stories we just looked at, they're very, very high level, right? But this gives us an idea of how we want the world to be different. We're describing this fiction of what the world could be from the dairy farmer standpoint, from the cow's standpoint. And then this is, you know, lots of work went into this and stuff, but this is what makes those stories, moves them from fiction to being the real world. So stories that support our principles will foster good development. But the converse of this is also true, that bad stories will hinder our development process. So I was working with a team in at a big bank in New York, and the business owner was gone when we started using user stories. So we'd write these out that as a I want to, so I can, and that was how we were starting to represent things, try to get things small and start delivering things. Well, he came back and people were kind of emailing around what they were working on. And they were expressing those user stories. And he emailed one of the developers and said, hey, you know, I know we're working with Mark, but is he having you write all the user stories in haiku now? Because I guess he had counted the syllables and figured that we were like, you know, this consultant comes in and convinced everybody that we're going to start writing our user stories in poetry, which I could totally see that happening. And I really want to almost try that sometime. Anyway, he was confused until he understood, and then they got everything together and it worked fine. But it was a interesting reaction to seeing user stories in that format for the first time. So like I said, they start out as fiction. They're written from the user's point of view. So if they're written from the user's point of view, that means progress means the user can do something new they couldn't do before. So if we think of that as being progress, user can do something new, then waste is going to be stories with no return on investment for the user. So here's a potential story. As a developer, I want a database with tables so I can store information. This is really valuable, right? I mean, we absolutely need this. There is no way we can deliver an application that needs a database if we don't do the work that this represents. But how does this user story make you feel? So really happy, like this is a great story, we need more of these, or really, really sad, I don't like it, it's uncomfortable. Okay, so we're tending toward this side of things over here. of it not being, we might see it, different ways to represent. Maybe it's a necessary evil. It's not really how we want to represent things, or it's horrible. I'm getting backwards here. It's horrible. We want to try to avoid this as much as possible. And if we think of that, so this story right here, as a developer, I want a database with tables so I can store information. What return on investment does the user get? What can they do after this is done? Well, most of the application would depend on this story, and the story would depend on at least designing the entire application. So from that standpoint, this is a bad story. Not because we don't want to have a database, but because this isn't oriented in the way that we want to design these little pieces of fiction about how the world is going to change, because this isn't something the user can actually experience. It's not designed around, this story isn't written around trying to figure out how do we change the user's world. This is about how we change the developer's world, which is very, very important. But we want that shift to think of everything we're doing in terms of the value it provides for the user. So if we think about why software projects fail, it's because they don't deliver working software. And if we have if we give ourselves permission to design stories that aren't being done from the standpoint of the way that it benefits the user and not build stuff from the user's perspective, it's very easy to do lots and lots of work without getting that feedback, without getting to the point that we can get feedback from the user in small slices and start finding out, is this really meeting their needs? So how does the user think about software, right? Because as a developer, as a fellow developer, when I start thinking about writing software, I start thinking about, well, what type of database do we need? I'm working on a system for some lunch and learn stuff we're doing. And I think about what's the database that should kind of be under this? What do we want as kind of these middle layers? And that's really how we think about things as developers. So kind of like this cake, right? Like if I'm thinking down here, what do I want to have down here as the database at the bottom, the candles on the top, maybe that's, do I want to use Angular or something like that up at the top? What layers are in between here? So this is how we tend to think as developers about our code. That's not how the user thinks about it, though. The user is going to think about it more as a slice of the cake. So they're going to think in terms of it, like let's say you've got an piece of accounting software. They're probably not going to think, oh yes, my accounting software is a database, and then on top of the database is all this stuff that enables the talking, like the object relational mapping that lets me talk to the database, and then above that, I've got all the business logic for all the different. No, that's not. They're going to think about it. Well, here's the slice. Here's the piece of this that lets me balance my checkbook. And here's the piece of it that lets me do payroll. And here's the piece of it over here that lets me send my invoices out to customer. It's a slice all the way through because that's how they experience the application. And more importantly, that's how they get value from the application. Now, when we start talking like this, usually the big objection is, well, we can't, you can't build a cake just a slice all the way at a time. I can't go up and bake one slice of a cake all the way through at a time. It's like, okay, we're making a birthday cake. I'm going to have 7 people here. I'm going to create slice number 1 with a candle on it, get it all baked. Now I'm going to create slice number 2, get it all, that doesn't work with cakes. I mean, the other way that I hear people say is you can't build a house without building the foundation first. And that is absolutely true, right? You're not going to build a slice of a house. You can't say, oh, you know what? The most important room in the house to me is the bathroom. So I'm going to build that first foundation and all the way through. And you can't do that with house. But code does not equal concrete. And a lot of times the metaphors we use to think about creating software will lead us astray because we take everything from the building industry. And there's some things that are very similar to building industry, but there's a lot of things that aren't. And this is where we have the power and dangers of metaphors, because these are really, really tied to the way that we think. We take physical experiences and use them to think about abstract ideas. So one way to think about when we're talking about things is, sketching versus carving. If I'm approaching my software from the standpoint of I write code, there's a book called The Engraving in the Stone about computer science. I think was the name of it, by the guy behind Thinking Machines. But if I approach the way that I think of my code as it's something I'm carving into stone, I'm going to end up in a very different place than if I think of it as something that I'm sketching for the user and I'm delivering little pieces of it. And if were any of you kids and you had these books of how to draw a horse, it's like you draw a circle here and lines here, another circle here, and a triangle, and then you kind of sketch over that, and eventually you end up with this thing that looks like a horse. But the original lines you drew, you may have even thrown away. You may not even have those anymore, and that's a process of sketching. On the other hand, it's not like you can do that with the Sphinx, right? It's not like they could say, okay, we're going to do this circle and then we're going to, cut it in and then we're going to cut it back out again. And we got, there's a different approach with actually building stuff with stone. So when we think about software, I think it's very helpful to think in terms of kind of how we think of a city, right? We build buildings in a city, but we grow a city. You don't just go out and build a city. Matter of fact, if you go to New York today, there are lots of, well, not a whole lot, but there are subway lines that used to be very, very important to the city that now are closed out because they've got something else that they need. They don't need that line anymore. It was not wasteful to have it there. It was part of the city's growth. And so I think cities are designed to respond to change. I mean, over a long period of time, they respond to change. You don't just go in and build all of New York and then say, hey, I hope we got everything right. No, there's constantly going through states of flux as population moves, as new technology becomes available. So this is a helpful way to think when we're thinking of our software, just to think in terms of growing our software versus building it. Okay, so question, if you've taken a philosophy class, you may recognize this, but if a ship replaces one board every year for 800 years, so eventually every part of the ship has been replaced, is it still the same ship? And this does relate to what we're talking about with software here. But so you've got a ship and you replace one board every year for 800 years, so eventually every part of the ship has been replaced. Is it still the same ship? You got this old pile of boards that were all the old things. So most of us are saying, yes, it's the same ship, which is a perfectly legitimate answer to this question. I think the U.S. Navy has a ship that is pretty much in this shape. They've replaced almost all of it over the years. So follow-up question to that. If a ship is replaced board by board over 800 years until every part of it has been replaced, but someone saves all the original pieces and at the end of 800 years reassembles it, which one is now the ship? Now, the interesting thing about this is if we take the first answer and say that, yes, you replace all the boards one by one and it's the ship, and then somebody grabs all the parts and puts them back together, it's almost as if the identity has shifted once that other thing is reassembled, right? Which is fascinating, has lots of implications for philosophy and stuff like that we're not going to get into here, mainly because I don't know a whole bunch about philosophy. But anyway, the reason I think this is useful is because this may be a more healthy way for us to think about software. So this story here actually comes from the ship of Theseus. So this is, Theseus went, he met his father for the first time, found out that his father was having to send, let's see, was it from Athens? Yeah, from Athens to Crete, all these children that were going to be fed to the Minotaur. Basically, Theseus stole the plot of Hunger Games, more or less. Anyway, so he says, I'll go, and he goes there, and then he gets into the labyrinth, kills the Minotaur, and then sails back. He sails back. That was such a big deal that they revered the ship. So he goes back home. Bad things happen and stuff. But anyway, that was the story of the ship of Theseus. Well, 800 years later, this thing is happening. This is Socrates. And they're going to poison Socrates because he's corrupting the minds of youth or whatever he was convicted of. Anyway, he couldn't be killed for 3 days. I think it was 3 days. So there's all these works of him talking with all the people that were around him. And the thing that's really impressive here is Socrates was what, 70 or 80 at this point stuff. And he's got those abs as a 70 or 80-year-old. He's in good shape, which does not match the historical account of it at all. Anyway, the reason that he had to wait around 3 days was because there was this sacred ship that had to go out and go on this journey every year as part of their religious things. That ship was the ship of Theseus. It was still around 800 years. Now, in the days of, well, probably the days of metal too, but the days of having wooden, building your ships from trees and stuff, lasting 800 years is a pretty amazing thing. All this stuff was replaced. And the thing I want to point out here with this is that ship was bigger than just the sum of its parts. It represented more than just, hey, we have a ship at this point in time. It was a process. There was this stream of changes that kept it functioning as a ship over this 800-year period. And I don't know what ended up happening to it after that, but it was still around by Socrates' time. I'm not saying there was a Minotaur, but there was some type of event that happened with somebody that was representing Theseus that started this ship, and it was kept on over time. Maybe he just went and defeated Crete or whatever. Anyway, if we think, so with that kind of back of our mind, we can probably think of our user stories as representing a stream of changes to a system. We get the system working, and then there's a stream of changes that go through that are kind of like replacing board by board whatever we've got in this ship. So what I want to do, what I want to look at here is let's walk through what this might look like for a company. This is a very old prestigious company called Sam's Shoes. And Sam is running this store. His father, Sam, ran the store, and his grandfather, Sam, ran the store, and his great-great-grandfather, Sam, started the store years ago. Sam's Shoe Store. Well, Sam is starting to compete with Zappos and other places, and he's trying to make sure that they can look into the future and be prepared. And more people are buying shoes online now, or they think that they might. So Sam has come to us and asked us to help put his business on the internet. And for some reason, we don't have the ability to just go out and buy, set them up with a shopping cart. So we're going to have to write these stories and create this software from scratch. So we start off with a story like this. As Sam, I want to sell shoes online so I can make money. Okay, that is a story, and this does represent who, what, and why we want to do it. But if we think in terms of working software being the primary measure of progress, that might not be the best way for us to represent our work. Maybe that's not the best way to break out this stream of changes to the state of the world. And you probably never had a story like this, but some people have experienced stories like this. As a user, I want the system to work, so I will be happy. And as funny as that sounds, I've had some business people try to give us stories like this. What do you want? I want it to do what I want it to do. Okay. Why? So I'll be happy with it. Well, can you tell us what you want to do? No, that's that's your job. Okay, so this isn't a very good story. So let's try to refine Sam's story a little bit here. So as Sam, I want to sell shoes online so I can make money. Well, to do this, that implies all kinds of things, right? We probably need a shopping cart, credit card processing, loyalty program, customer login, saved addresses, inventory, recommendation engine. There's a huge number of things that could actually be part of Sam wanting to sell shoes online so he can make money. So let's think about what's the smallest. We're going to assume Sam has some type of inventory system already. What is the very smallest thing we could possibly do that's one step toward giving Sam this value? And I can't see the chat, so just speak up. There's not a right answer here, but what's the smallest thing we might be able to do that's a step toward that?
A website.
Creating a website. Yes, get some type of, if Sam doesn't have any website yet, maybe getting a domain name, that might actually be the first step, right? There's all these really, really small things that we could possibly do. Any other ideas? What else would be a small step?
Have shoes.
Have shoes. Yeah, well, Sam's got shoes. He's got his very old, prestigious shoe store that's out there. So we've got shoes. But yes, if you didn't have any shoes or any way to show shoes, that would be a first step, right? There's these very small things. And kind of along with the idea of the website. So the one that I came up with is, as a customer, I want to see inventory so I can call to order. So Sam has a list of inventory. And so we'll assume he's got a website, or we'll build one. And we just want to get his inventory and put it up online so people can see what Sam has. So think something like this, right? We got Sam's Shoes, call to order 1-800-SAM-SHOE, and there's a list of everything and how much it costs, and it just goes down the page. And these graphics you're going to see will give you a very strong idea of why I've been hired many times as an Agile coach, never as a graphic designer for people's websites. So anyway, got this list of shoes over here. Very, very simple. It's just a single page of all the shoes they have and the prices on it. So what's the return on investment from that? Well, hopefully we can get some orders. We can get metrics. We can prove out assumptions. If we get some orders, we make some money from it. We might discover that Sam's shoe store is so old and prestigious that none of his customers actually would be willing to use the internet, because whatever type of shoes he's selling, think maybe Kingsman style clothing, whatever shoes he's trying to sell, you come in person to talk to Sam about your shoes. So you might find that no one's even interested in the website of his current customers. And if it's just different customers, it might make him do something different. Maybe he needs a different brand for the shoes he's selling online or something. You get metrics and prove out assumptions. And now, what happens a lot of times is when developers start looking at this, like, well, that's easy. It's just one page thing. I could do that in a day. Let's get something bigger. But usually, in many situations, there's a huge amount of stuff that actually has to go into this, right? You've got to somehow get your local database, figure out how to get it onto the web. So maybe you need a hole in your firewall. There's lots and lots. Yeah, pick what type of programming language you're going to use. There's lots and lots of stuff that probably has to happen as this. So we want this story as small as possible, but something that actually delivers value. And being able to do these things right here, in getting metrics, maybe you put a different 800 number on the page in order to keep track that they came from the website. There's things you can do out like that, proving out the assumptions. So there's a company called Zappos. Do you guys have Zappos in Canada? They were bought by Amazon. Okay, they sell shoes online, which was a really big deal when they started doing it because they didn't have any evidence that people would actually buy shoes online. I mean, maybe there was something about buying shoes as like, I wouldn't put anything on my feet that come in the mail. We don't know. Now, people buy shoes online. We know that's not the case, but at the time they started, that wasn't something that had really been completely proven out how well you could get people to buy shoes, because that's usually something you think of, you need to go to the store and try out. So what Zappos did is they said, we want to actually prove out our assumptions that people will buy shoes online. So they had some type of e-commerce platform. They went down to Foot Locker, which is would be like at shopping malls and stuff, and have different tennis shoes and stuff. And they bought a bunch of different pairs of shoes, took them back to their office, took pictures of them, and then returned them all to Foot Locker. They put these all online, bought some others. They probably went around to different stores to like spread it out. But after a while, they had this nice inventory of lots of shoes online that they were selling. People came in and placed orders. When they placed an order, they went back to Foot Locker, bought the shoe, came back, packaged it up, and sent it to the customers. Which sounds crazy. It's like, well, they were even losing money with that. But what they were doing was proving out that the system worked and was able to deliver value to their customer. And if they had to do some crazy stuff behind the scenes to deliver that value, it was worth it because they could build this whole thing and discover that no one actually was interested in buying shoes online. Anyway, they took that approach and were able to get a lot of evidence for what they were doing early on. But I thought it was a very ingenious way to take part of the process that you most assume you need in order to start delivering value, the part of actually having shoes, and like, yeah, we're not going to do that part. We got another way to do that. We're going to focus on making sure that we actually have a system for delivering the shoes to the customer. Okay, so back to Sam's shoe store. So our next story. What's the simplest next step we could possibly do for Sam's shoes? So we've got a page. It just lists what there is in our inventory. They can call us. What's the next thing that we could do? Just any ideas?
You place an order?
What now?
Just place an order? Like just select a shoe.
Place an order?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Give them away.
But not paying. Like just not paying. Just I want this, and you put your address, but not paying. Yeah. Could be.
Yeah, so you could have a step that just they fill it out and you'd reserve it for them, and they're still coming in, or maybe you call them up and ship it to them. Depending on how prestigious Sam's shoe stores are, they may know everyone's like personal cell phone number of all their customers that they've had for generations. So yes, that would be a very legitimate next step that could be very useful. The one I happen to have here is, as a customer, I want to order online so I don't have to call. So in thinking of the simplest way to do this, and what you described would probably be even a better next step. I may need to rearrange my slides because I like that even better. What we've done here is we've made it, you can just go in and we've got our first page that lists everything, and then there's an order button now. And you can see my highly developed sense of graphic design in play here. It's green to make you want to click on it. You click on order and it takes you to a page, and now you can type in your size, name, address, and credit card number, place order. So we've only added a single page to this application. And I bet most of you here could do this. This might be even a half a day's worth of work to actually just add this to an application that had all the inventory there, right? You're adding a single page, you click on a button, you go to this page, and then it submits it to the database. Maybe it doesn't stick it in the database. Maybe you even just email Sam Shoes or something like that. But there's a lot of other work that would need to go into this, right? We need to figure out some way of securely doing the credit card number. We're going to have credit card processing. Where there's lots of stuff. As simple as this seems, there could be a lot of things behind the scenes actually to take this next step. So we wouldn't want this story any bigger. And I think, as Lewis pointed out, we might even be able to find a way to make it even smaller and be able to separate the idea of now putting stuff in the database from the need for all the credit card stuff. So that may be even a better just next step for them. So next story, we might have something like, as a customer, I want to add items to a cart so I can order multiple items. So here's my thing. I can now have a cart that I can now put things in the cart and then do something with it, and then maybe I can take it out of the cart before I buy it. As a customer, I want to save my address so I don't have to re-enter it. Or maybe as a customer, I want to save my credit card so I don't have to re-enter it. So there's all these really, really small steps. But if you notice, all these things are very much driven from what the customer wants. And we've left out any stories, or we haven't designed our work around the infrastructure or the architecture. So I'm working with another team right now, and they've got kind of two sub-teams. One team is very much focused on delivering these types of stories. Everything describes, here's how the user will interact with this, and taking the smallest possible thing that they can show the user that the user says, hey, yes, that's closer to the end system I want. I can do something else with this. The other team has a lot of people from an architectural mindset on it. Their stories, the thing that takes the most time is just understanding what their stories, like what the state of the world will be like once one of their stories are done. Because it completely defines the architecture of what they want to do, but no one, including the people that wrote it, is very sure often what actually is delivered to the customer out of those stories. But it's two very, very, very different approaches. And it's interesting seeing these because it's on the same project. And so these things are happening side by side. And the ones that are really driven by what it gives the user are delivering really, really fast flow. Very small changes, but fast flow. They're establishing, they're building the confidence with the user that they can make things and change it. If the user says, hey, that thing I asked you for isn't the way I want it, I want something else, they know that they can get that changed probably in a few days. On the other side, the one that's driven by the architecture has this hope that by building out all these different layers ahead of time, they'll then someday get to the point of nirvana where development becomes very, very easy. And while that makes sense from the standpoint of, hey, yes, having good foundation in place is very, very useful, it never seems to work out quite as well as we think it will. So that's where Agile really tries to get us focused on how do we deliver value all the way through. Okay, so question for you. At what point do you have a new software application? Is it once the last line of original code base has been replaced through a process of weekly changes? Is it when the new application is created and the old data is all migrated over? Or both A and B is a new application? And like I said, this is just your opinion. Someday, maybe in our philosophy classes, we'll be talking about software rather than the ship of Theseus. But the point here to think about, though, is that our software is going to evolve. And if we can design our stories with the idea of how to take that next step, it's going to let us stay in a situation where we're delivering value on a regular basis. Okay, so it looks like most of us are kind of in the camp of either way, it's a new application. Okay, so we kind of came through talking about how to center our stories around what the user wants, trying to make sure that we've got small enough pieces of things that we can actually deliver it, because there's all this technical stuff that happens in the background, and trying to have all that technical stuff of setting up database, setting up credit card authentication, everything like that, as much as possible tied to the user story that it enables. So let me pause there for a second. How does that sound? Does that sound like crazy talk? Are you seeing value in that? And it's fine to say it sounds like crazy talk if you think it does, or what you see valuable and what you think isn't.
It makes a lot of sense to me. It's yeah. I have lots of questions, but it makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
Okay, cool. And lest anything I say here makes it sound like this is really, really easy. This is very, very hard to do. So what are some of the questions that come to mind as you do this? I've got some other stuff to go through, but let's make sure we hear your questions.
To me, and I'm sure like everyone's experience is different, but I write user stories usually, and my biggest challenge is how do I handle exceptions, because I have like as a user I want solution A because solution A will allow me to get these benefits, but if I'm user B, I want solution B, and sometimes I'm user A and I want solution B if I'm located in another country, and like there's like tons of exceptions, and like that's
That is a very, very good question. And I like how that's a good example. I may steal your example for some other things sometime. So I think what we want to try to be guided by in that situation is thinking about how do I get to the point, the smallest amount I can do that provides value for somebody in the system. So I may choose to do something that only, we're going to deploy this. We've got 10 different countries and it needs to work different in each 10 of the 10 countries. Maybe I start with the thing that gets it working in one country. And we don't even have it turned on for other countries because that gives us a step toward value. And then maybe you have even a different story for each country. Now, in a lot of cases, once you solve the big problems for one country, you can then knock out the other 9 pretty easily because you've already done the work. Now you just need to set up the exceptions for these different countries, or maybe you batch it these 3 and these 4 or something like that. So that's well, that doesn't add to 9, but these 3 and these 6. Doing math, getting thrown off here. But does that make sense? How you can just trying to figure out, if you think in terms of how could I deploy this to where somebody could benefit from it, it may help tell you here's the edges of where you should write this particular story.
Yeah, it does. It does. But sometimes, what if you have a change that you have no choice, but it will affect everyone, and you have to handle exceptions? And I guess it's always possible to make it as small as possible, but like you have, I don't know how to express it if someone wants to take over, but what if you have a change that will affect everyone and you have to handle the exceptions without like being able to like target specifically one case? I don't know if that makes sense.
So situations where it's like this touches enough things and any piece I change will affect everything else. I can't do this as a 2-day story. It's going to be bigger, right?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Okay. And you're always, keep in mind with lots of the idea of small stories, small changes through to production is what you're striving for. There are some things that are just hard that are not going to work like that, right? And I think it's not that you're going to make those cases never be there, but you wanted to make sure that you don't make the cases like that when they actually could be split up. And the other piece of this too is teams I've seen that really try to do this, they end up building software in a way that supports these small pieces. And so they kind of trend toward having fewer things that fall in that other bucket because every decision they've made is trying to find ways of doing things small. So they end up with a solution overall that leans away from having those really big things like that. But that doesn't mean that you never have something where like, hey, this is going to take 2 weeks before we can deliver, or even a month before we can deliver it, because all these things have to be there at one time. That is some of that's just the reality of the world we live in, and we may never be able to solve all of it. So this isn't about everything needs to be this way, but the stuff that could be this way, we want to make sure we're not overlooking those things. Does that help?
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you.
So let's look at very, very good question. Let's look at some of the reasons we might want to split stories up like this, and then we'll have some more time for some other questions here pretty soon. Okay, so here we've got stuff that's going to be existing functionality. So in this particular situation, these slides were made for a team that was getting ready to replace an existing system. So they had an old system and had been using it, and they were needing to replace it. And if you've ever been in a situation, and I think you guys may well be, a situation where you're trying to write a new version of an existing system, there's all this existing functionality you've got, and then there's all the new features that you're using to justify rewriting the system. But no one wants to go live without having this existing functionality in place. So oftentimes you get into a situation where it's like, I've got to rewrite everything before I can even get over here and start working on the new features. So if we imagine something like that, what I've seen happen at a lot of banks, let's see if this matches with your experience, is you end up doing something like this. So we're redesigning the system, we're recreating a system, going to come out with a new version of it, and it's a complete or mostly complete rewrite. So we build a little bit of existing functionality here, and then we say, hey, we really want to show how we're justifying doing this rewrite. So now we're going to do some new features. And then you build a little bit more of existing functionality. And like, oh yeah, now we want to show management how cool this new feature is that we're trying to get in here. A little bit more of existing functionality. And we keep on going across like this. Well, what this means is if you need all that existing functionality to go live, you don't have anything you can deploy live until you get all the way over here. And this is an approach that causes a lot of software projects to fail. So if we rearrange this then and do this, we now have the ability, we get everything, all the existing functionality in place, we could potentially deploy this. So in this case, we might be able to deploy right here, halfway through the project, where previously we weren't going to be able to deploy until we got all the way here to the end. And what I want us to think about here is the risk that's involved in not getting things live, in sequencing our work in ways that defer to the future when something can actually go live. So if we put, so imagine here, let's show when I made the slides, I guess. So we're going through different quarters. If I could go live here and then start iterating on this, I can now get the value through this whole process, where before I didn't get any value from all the stuff we had done until we got to the very end. So if you've seen any of the literature on scaled agile framework, one thing I like that they talk about is preserving options. And there's lots of stuff they talk about that I don't like, but the preserving options stuff is very good. So we went through that. So can we preserve more options in being able to deliver value quicker? So let's break these out again, and let's say that we have existing functionality, and a subset of that is minimally viable. So if we think of our system, we're going to go, what's the smallest thing we could go live with, even if we're losing features, right? So the thing that we could actually say, this works enough, I can go live. Like, think of the shoe store. Maybe I can go live, but it doesn't store my credit card information. You have to type that in each time. You know, the being able to place orders is minimally viable. Existing functionality is we can store people's credit card. So if we're doing a rewrite of a system here, if I order my stuff like this top line and I do existing functionality, new features, oh, here's this thing that I absolutely cannot go live without, another new feature that I don't have today, existing functionality that I have today, but if push came to shove, I would be willing to go live without it, and go across like this. Well, I don't get to the point that all my minimally viable work is done until the very, very end over here. Whereas if I order this differently, I can do this, right? I get to this point. I've now got an option of going live that I did not have before. I could go live with my minimally viable system, even if it doesn't have these three green things that replace that get me to parity with existing functionality. And then I can start adding new features. So I've got the option to go live here. I've got the option to go live here, the option to go live here, the option to go live here. And then once, let's say I go live here, now I'm just iterating and building on the system that's there. So if my user, and I think of these slots as being individual user stories or even features, if those things are small enough and independent enough, I now have the ability to start sequencing my work like this. And so in this case, I've got, I have the ability, I may want to target going live right here, but I can choose to delay it. Here, I don't have the option, right? I don't even have minimal functionality until I get all the way through to the very end of this. So those are some of the things we should think about when thinking about how to represent our work and why it can be so valuable. Because if we're able to represent discrete units of value that we give, we've now got the ability to sequence them in different ways, like we've got here. How does that resonate? What do you guys think of that? I've got another exercise I want to do, but I'd like to hear what types of thoughts that inspires first.
I think that makes a lot of sense.
I'm not go ahead.
Go ahead, Claire.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I already saw a company willing to lose existing functionality for some time. So even if you do the minimal viable thing, but you lose things that customers had before, I don't think it would be acceptable for the company.
So that's a very good point. So most of the time, what I hear you saying is most of the time, you may find management isn't willing to go live until they get to here, right?
Yes.
Okay. So and I think that's very true. And you may find that's always the case. However, there are situations you can find yourself in where you may be willing to go live without some of those existing functionality features. And that's where figuring out what is the minimally viable thing that we might be willing to go live with even if we're not willing, when we start the process over here, we might not be willing to go live with this. We maybe think we wouldn't be willing to go live here. But if we do it in this order up here, we don't even have that option. And this can be a very difficult conversation to have, particularly with management, but thinking through the process to make sure that we're not thinking in terms of the way things look today, but we're thinking in terms of what possible futures might be out there. And there are different possible futures that might put us in a position where having this ability to go live could be very, very useful to us. If our existing platform, something happens and actually makes it to where it is unusable now, something catastrophic happens, some new regulation happens, some vulnerability is discovered, there are different futures that could happen that might make it very, very good to have this possibility. So the goal isn't to say we have to take this possibility of going live. The goal is to make sure we have the option to choose to do so, and we haven't built things in a way that make it impossible to choose to do so. We can't go back in time from here, right here. We can't go back in time and shift these things around and trade work we did for other work that we wished we did. Does that make sense?
Yeah, absolutely.
But that is a very, very good point. And I think that's where you run into a lot of trying to get management and leadership to see that they're not making a decision that you have to go live there with reduced functionality, but trying to show them that they want to have the option to do so. Takes a lot of conversation in it. And it's very, very difficult conversations to have.
I think that's where we aim to go as well. I mean, we had some project in the past where we're doing like the first when we're like the first like we're doing entering all the new feature and existing feature at the same time. For our new mobile app right now, we have I think we have passed our like yellow section for minimal viable product, and then the management team is able to test it right now. I mean, we're still in the adding the existing feature, but at least we have a version that they can start testing. And then our like CEO was saying, "Oh, can we go live with this?" He said, "Oh, we're missing this, we're missing this, we're missing this." Right? Maybe we don't want to go live, but he was kind of excited that at least be having a product that he can test. You don't want his end user to be able to use it, but at least as a CEO, he see the product and he's kind of proud of saying, "Okay, we have something. I know we're going to deliver something soon."
Right.
So at least we're starting a new first phase of phases with that like minimal viable product. So we are starting to doing test and product with like limited number of people, but at least we're able to start selling something for real. Yeah.
So that's excellent. You're able to start having those conversations. You can see something. We've got this existing functionality that right now we're not willing to go live without, and for very, very good reason. But even within that existing functionality, you should be having hard conversations about how you sequence that work, because not all of it may be at the same threshold. If there's probably some of it that if you say we won't have this for 5 years, they would say, okay, we're willing to leave these things off. And there's other stuff that they would say absolutely not. If you get that sequence right, and if you can have those conversations between developers and business and really get that sequencing right, that is a huge competitive advantage in the marketplace, because it means you're doing things in the optimal order. And it means that if you are doing the optimal order, then you're saying, okay, this piece of existing functionality, there is no way we would be willing to go live with. This next piece, there's almost no way, but there's a few circumstances that we might be willing to go live without it. Well, make sure you do the thing that is absolutely impossible to go live without before you do the things that are like, well, we really don't want to go live with this, but we could if we had to. And those can be really hard conversations to have, particularly if you have lots of people that have different views about which piece of the software is important to them. I was working with this was with the Federal Reserve Bank system in the United States provides lots of services for banks across the country. But they're kind of in the market they are competing against other services that other banks and other financial institutions provide. And they were working on rewriting the billing system for that. And it was really, really hard to have conversations about what are the features we want, because the justification for rewriting everything was these new features, right? It was the new stuff they were getting. So everybody wanted the new features to be in the version 1 that went live. And like you said, Claire, no one wanted to lose any existing functionality. So it was really hard to get people to focus on the minimally viable of saying, hey, we could actually process billing with these minimal features, even if it doesn't have a lot of the things that we want. And in the meeting where we were going through stuff, we were trying to create 2 buckets. There was one bucket that was minimally viable to go live, and then there was the other bucket of everything else. And it was impossible to get people to put stuff in the stuff that would come after we go live. And the reason was because everybody had this experience that if you don't get in your first release, you probably aren't ever going to get it. So everybody was fighting for everything being in that minimally viable. And what one of the BAs did that I thought was very brilliant is he broke it down and said, okay, we've got the stuff the core stuff that to be able to do billing. And that should be a sacred bucket, and nothing should go in there unless it is absolutely necessary. There's no possible way, even with manual work, to do billing without it. If there's something that requires some manual work in the database, but we could do billing with that manual work, it doesn't even make it in the minimal viable. So we're even willing to do stuff manually on our own. So then we've got this other bucket that is the stuff that's not in that category. And then he introduced a third bucket in the middle, the fast follow bucket. He said, this is the stuff that doesn't quite make it to minimally viable, but we need to make sure we know is very, very important and needs to come as soon as possible afterwards. And then we got to, and it was still really hard conversations, but then we got to the point that people were willing to say, I understand that we could process a bill without having this feature, but you let me put it in that center bucket of fast follow, and now I know that you're recognizing it's important enough that since I know you're recognizing that it's more important than everything else, I'm willing not to fight for it being in the minimally viable. Well, those were very, very hard conversations. One example of this was of a conversation I remember from about 10 years ago was this was a system for the U.S. Treasury. And it had, I think I may have used this example before, but I'll give it again in case. They needed to keep track of all the federal holidays in it. So it's a very important thing, right? The system needed to know when the holidays were. And their existing system had a UI that you'd go in and you could see what the holidays were. It was an admin, just in the admin side of things. You could see all the holidays that were there, and then you could go in and add them and change them if new holiday changed, or if you needed to tell it what day it was going to be on because it's something that isn't set by the date. So that's what their existing system had. Well, when they were talking about this, it was like, well, this is existing functionality. And in their mind, it was minimally viable. You had to have this to go live. But by really, really talking and saying, okay, is this really higher priority than these other things we need? Business finally said, you know what? We and the developers worked together and said, you know what? We could load this in for the next year just directly from the database. And if we do that, we're good for a year without having the UI. So that moves from the standpoint from minimally viable to being its existing functionality, but it's existing functionality that we could go live with if we don't. So it has to come after the stuff that we absolutely could not go live without. And it was a hard conversation, but once they kind of got in the habit of doing that, they got really, really good at it. And they were throwing things out, ripping things out, saying, well, this can come later, this can come later, and this can come later. But it was very, very hard to get over that hump of being able to prioritize getting the system live or having the option of taking the system live over getting all the features that they want to have in it. And the way that they were able to do that is this team had been delivering very, very regularly, even though it wasn't going to, well, they were actually delivering all the way through to production. It just wasn't the system of record yet. The system that they were going to replace was still running. But they had a track record of every few days, they got new functionality all the way through. And when management started seeing that and trusted the development team to get stuff all the way through like that, they were willing to have some of those harder conversations and say, yes, this can come later because we trust once it is the highest priority, we can actually get it in. Okay, any other questions around kind of the sequencing stuff or creating user stories? Okay, so let's do an example, and then we'll come back if there's anything anybody else thinks of. So I'm going to have you help me design an application that's going to make me a billionaire. This is why I do consulting, is like get really good ideas for people. So we're wanting to design my new mobile app, and it's called Mark's Money Minder. Right? So it's a budgeting mobile app. We're going to automate as much as possible. It's going to integrate with banks. It's going to let you set budgets for various categories and track expenses. And everybody's going to be so excited about buying this application that it's going to I'll retire within five years. Okay, and so what I want us to do is think through. So this is we've got a budgeting app that's going to work on mobile platform. We want as automatically as possible. We want people to be able to keep track of their budgets. If they buy something from Netflix, once they've established that category, it goes directly into the category. So we want to create this. How do we start? How do we get, because there's a lot of things here, right? The budgeting mobile app, that seems, having budgets for categories, that seems pretty straightforward. Integrating with banks, when I wrote this slide was not as easy to do. There are some ways to do that now that are a little bit easier, but there's still a lot that goes into doing that. And so there's lots of stuff that happens in here. Oh, and we need really good security on it. So what would be a small first step toward building my financial budgeting empire here, right? Can you think of what would be a really, really small first story of something from the user standpoint? So something that's usable, that we could actually get people to start using. So we will get it in the app store and stuff. And that some people, some early adopters, some small portion of our target market might actually download and be able to start using in one way or another. What would be the smallest user story you can think of that might fall in that category?
As a user, I want an application that lets me enter my expenses.
Okay, yeah, that's great, right? We've got all this automation we want, but maybe we punt on that. We just have a way for them to start entering their expenses in it. So it's just a maybe even think of it as an electronic version of your checkbook, right? It doesn't integrate with your bank. It's just you can add lines of expenses from your account. Is that kind of what you're thinking?
Yep.
Okay, yeah, and that's great, right? Our target audience is likely to be people that might be interested in using something like that. They may be fine with putting stuff in. Not the whole audience. A lot of people are going to want the automation, but we could actually get this in front of users and start getting some feedback from it, and they could start getting some value from it. And maybe we can even get venture funding once we have that part of it done. So that's great. What would be a next story? Like, what's another idea of a next story we could possibly add?
As a user, I want to be able to see my budget.
Right. Oh, yeah, that's great. So having some way of saying we're adding expenses. So we got that part working, and now we're going to come up with a way to say here's the budget for these different categories. Right? I can say what it is, and maybe we go back in the way that we're adding the checkbook stuff. We've got to tell them what category it's in, and each category gets a budget. Or maybe we already had the categories, but each category gets a budget added to it, and you can kind of see how far you are in that. So that's great. It's very, very simple. That's the type of thing you could deliver quickly. It would be an upgrade it would be a step forward for everybody. It would make their world better. Any of the users that have it. Some of the users that weren't willing to use it before might be willing to use it now. But yes, that's a nice incremental step. What's the next step we can think of?
As a user, I want to add recurring like income or expenses. So every month I have rent, so recurring.
Okay. So being able to take, we've got the concept of adding expenses kind of ad hoc. And I think what you're saying is being able to set some of these things up to where you're going to pay it every month. That just shows up automatically as you go instead of having to type it in over and over and over again.
Exactly. And
Yeah.
not having like the integration with banks yet.
That's great. Actually, and that's really good because as we think of the future, there may be some things that integrating with the banks will do, but you still may need that functionality of just setting recurring stuff for things that maybe, trying to think, for expenses or income. Yeah, that still may continue to be useful even after you add the bank integration. But even if it's not, like you may find some of your customers aren't willing to integrate with the bank. So maybe that recurring functionality would be exactly what they want. You could find that no one uses it after you do the integration with the banks, but that's okay if we're trying to grow the application versus trying to just figure out everything ahead of time. If you put code in and it helps you gain customers and move forward, and later that code's not needed, that's not a waste. It's kind of like if you're building a skyscraper or something, you've got scaffolding that goes up and around it. The fact that you remove that scaffolding, you don't look at that and say, "Oh, it was such a waste. We had to build that scaffolding to build this whatever it was," and like look at how horrible this is because we've got to take the scaffolding. No, that the scaffolding was there to help you do what you needed to do, and code can be this similar way. Okay, one more? What's another next step we could possibly take?
Probably add the income that we have to compare.
Have it set up for the income that's coming in. We've
Yes,
been dealing
because-
with expenses. Oh, that's
Yeah.
good. No, that's a very, very good idea.
Yes.
Have something to add the income, so we're now not just dealing with here's what's outgoing, but here's how I can kind of project, and that would let us do projections like how much money you're going to have. So yeah, that's great. That's very, very good. Other things I can think of that might be potential next steps is we've got these things of integrating with banks. We might pick one bank that we want to target and integrate just with them. I mean, depending on what the frameworks and stuff we're doing, but maybe we form a partnership with a bank. Some banks out there look and say, "Hey, this application looks like it's really taking off," and you work with them and say, "Hey, can we make you the first bank?" And maybe that gives you some ability to market to their customers, and also gives you the first step you can do with it. So, lots of different things there. But what I want us to think about is the fact we haven't talked anything really about the technology. Like, we're not thinking in terms of how this stuff is stored in the database. We're not thinking in terms of whether we want to use Flutter or some other framework around it and stuff. Those decisions have to be made and will be very, very important. But the way we've talked through this has been entirely from the standpoint of how do we give the user new capability that they didn't have before. And that can be a very, very powerful way to approach our stories. And I think from what I've seen, I think you guys are kind of in that. You tend more toward doing that already just naturally than a lot of the teams that I work with on this, because I know a lot of places that are very much, their stories will tell you what the architecture does, but it doesn't tell you very much about what the application actually does for the user. Okay, so let's see. Are there any questions? Okay, how do we handle user stories where there can be exceptions to it?
This was mine, yeah. You can
That was
read.
your question from earlier? Okay, yeah, that was a very, very good, very, very good question. Okay, any other thoughts? Actually, I'm going to throw this over onto a, yeah, actually, we'll skip that too. Okay, so let me pick this up. Okay, so we got through the kind of the presentation. I want to make sure we had lots of time to talk through anything else. So how does this feel overall? How is this different than what you're doing now? How is it maybe the same as what you're doing now? What are your thoughts on that?
I think our story are more technical most of the time than just simple.
Is there, do you see how there could be value focusing more on the value it provides for the user and then letting the technical stuff follow from that? Or are you in a place where you really need the technical stories?
Or like when we create a user stories can be, I want to create a REST API definition. After that, another one, it's implementation. So it's more technical than just as a customer, I want to be able like to enter a credit card and store it.
Okay. So if I understand what you're saying, you have a lot of stories like create the API, and then you create the UI after you've got the API in place, and then that can be delivered together through to the user.
Yes.
Okay.
The user story are split like that right now.
Okay. Does that seem to work pretty well?
I would say yes, because we are able to deliver. But sometimes you need to wait after another one to do something.
So okay, so I'm glad you brought that up. Let me throw out here what I've seen some teams experience in shifting from what you just described to more of full slice. Now, I'm sharing experience that other teams have had. This doesn't mean, I'm not trying to say you're doing it wrong. If you're getting really, really good results from it, obviously do things that you're getting really, really good results from. So that's awesome. But I want to throw out this other idea because some teams have found this has been pretty, pretty valuable. So please don't take any of this as a criticism of the process that you're on right now. This is just, here's another approach that some teams have found useful. So right now, you've got two building blocks it sounds like you'll work on as kind of the back end. Do you have another separate story for defining the API?
Yes, we have one for define and one for implementing.
Okay, so you got one for defining it, one for implementing it, and then once that's done, then you work on the front end?
Yeah.
Okay. So the thing that you may see some gains from by thinking more full slice is what you've just described is fairly sequential work. Like you can't build the API till it's been defined, and you can't build the UI until the API is in place, or maybe some of that can happen in parallel. But for
It
most
can be
part,
defined, but
okay. So, okay, you're saying once it's defined, you could start on the UI side of it because you know what it's going to look like?
Yeah.
Okay. So, what I've seen with some teams is that when doing the work like that, it can work very, very well for them, but they lose some of the flow they can get by actually integrating those activities with the smallest thing that they possibly can of thinking of it in terms of the value that's being provided rather than thinking of building it in terms of the way the architecture sure works. But what you end up in those situations is a lot more. Let me ask this other question then. Are each of those three things usually done by one person? So like you have one person doing the API, one person doing the UI, and then maybe one person defining it, or maybe it's the same person that defines it?
Most of the time, the definition and implementation is done by the same person.
Okay.
UI, normally it can be someone else. I would say half the time. It's
Okay.
other.
Okay. So there's usually two people involved in those things, and they're working on stuff fairly separate from each other, right? Okay.
Yeah.
So what I've seen some teams do when they were working that way and were looking for ways to do things more full slice is they found that by taking the entire story, but putting the two people, even if the work is happening similar to what you're describing, by dealing with the unit of work in terms of what's delivered for the user, then those two people worked more closely together to go ahead and collaborate on what they were doing. And because what can happen sometimes with that is you get the back end working exactly the way that we defined for it to work. The UI starts building it exactly the way that they thought it was going to work. And then you find out, oh, you know what? This doesn't quite work. This needs to change here in order to make this work. And there's all the things that it's not for lack of planning. It's just the fact that when you actually experience it, you have a different idea of it. So when they structure the work from the standpoint of delivering the entire piece of value, even if it's the two people working on it, they're still collaborating more, and they're not feeling that they've accomplished something until that entire thing is delivered. And I've seen some people, they get on and they're even go into a video room together or the same room together if they're physically in the same place, and they're working on it, but they're right there asking questions as they go back and forth. And so it grows together, even if it's defined ahead of time. I mean, they're able to make those decisions really, really quickly, driven by here's the value we provide to the customer. And what some teams have found in those situations is that they can deliver things faster and higher quality by doing that because you have more of this really rapid feedback between the two aspects that are being represented. Does that sound like a crazy idea in your experience, or it may not even seem even better, just as another possibility?
But I know that right now it's going sometimes well, but sometimes you can see in the UI, oh, he's missing something or something like that. So it's because of that we can start the UI when the definition is merged, because you can call after that if you need to make change. It's easier, but it depends what we are doing also.
Right. And from what you described, you probably have lots of situations where what you're doing, breaking it up, works pretty well for you. I think the thing to think about is probably if you were to take a different approach, would those particular situations still work just about as well, but the situations that are difficult maybe would be a little bit better? Would it actually, on average of everything, might it be a step closer toward delivering faster value through to the user? Another reason to think about that full slice thing is if we're looking in terms of trying to create predictability from the way that we work on things, having stories split up to where we've got this story that's the API, this is the UI, and then this story over here was the planning for it. we've got stories now that are smaller than the thing that we can deliver to the user. So if we look back over the last 6 months and say, how many stories do we think we can complete in this period of time? It might average out to about the same thing, but you're going to have a little bit harder time extrapolating unless you, I guess you could do some more complicated math to do it, but it's still not delivered. Your metrics aren't going to be as tied to here's the number of independent things we deliver to the user, because some of those things aren't actually independent. You can probably find a way to get the predictability pretty well for that. But one thing I found that often works well for teams is, well, what I've seen teams struggle is like, okay, push the story size down, make it as small as possible. Well, then I end up seeing a story that's something like, put a button in the HTML. It doesn't do anything, right? There's no value for the user there whatsoever, other than they can now see the button. And like, is that really a user story? How does that make the user's world better? Like, well, they can see this button and they like the color. Like, okay, but you haven't changed what they can actually do. So it was Einstein that said things should be made as simple as possible, but no simpler. And if our stories are kind of guided by what's the smallest thing we can deliver that the user says, yes, this is a step forward in my ability to do something. My world has changed in a way that's better than it was yesterday. I can do something, no matter how small that is. That does put something of a lower bound on how small you can make your stories, because it's got to be something you can deploy that they could actually experience. There's just something to think about. Any other thoughts, comments around that?
Well, I think one of the reasons that we're separating our work right now as it is because we used to have more stories built around slices or feature, and then we had subtasks. So under you had the story that was like, yeah, I want to add a button, and then under it I had define the API, integrate the API, create the UI, and we decided along the way a few years ago to like stop doing that, because that was complicated to follow up, like what's actually completed and what can I do. So we went and like flattened the structure of the work to do. And maybe
So
we were
let me
wrong.
make sure I understand. You used to have stories in the subtasks. You basically brought the subtasks up to the story level now. Is that accurate?
Yeah, and
Yeah.
and now they're the responsibility of each developer. When we used to have stories that were assigned to the BAs, so the
Okay.
BAs were involved, and then the developers had the subtasks assigned.
Okay. And that does sound like a very good evolution of saying, no, our units of work are the stories. These tasks really are functioning more as story level. We're going to move it up here. That sounds like a good thing, because I know that there's a lot of, and the thing that makes this hard is like one team calls this a subtask, the other team calls it a story, another calls it a feature, another calls it an epic, and then if you're dealing with safe, they flip epic and feature. And I was just talking to somebody else about this morning. Is like, okay, let's think of some generic way to talk about what we are, because we're all using different words to mean the same thing, or same thing in different words. But here's another way that you might think of it. As a developer, there are units of work that when I complete, I get that. Is it dopamine, the thing your brain sends out when you like something good happens? So as a developer, when I complete things, I get this dopamine hit. And it feels good, right? I've accomplished something. I want to make sure that I structure my work so that dopamine hit is tied to delivering something to the user. If I get it because I've completed a subtask, but if I'm structuring my work in a way that I'm getting it from the subtask, but I'm not actually delivering, then my internal way I feel good about myself is not as aligned with delivering value to the user. And the more those things are aligned, the better we're going to be able to collaborate with the users and with business to make sure we're all moving toward the exact same goal and all feeling good about ourselves for the things that we really want to feel good about ourselves from. So that's where you are right now. And Jira and different tools do this different ways. I'm sometimes a big fan of not assigning tickets to individuals. And the reason is because I really want the team to be responsible for finishing that ticket and getting it into the hands of the user. And if I give you this ticket and you this ticket and you this ticket, then I know for me, I'm focused on how I do my part, not how I help the team as a whole deliver the next thing that could possibly be delivered. So if we have full slice stories that include whatever, maybe you still have two people that are going to be working on them, and maybe it makes sense to assign somebody to. I'm not saying you can't, but we want that mentality of this is how we deliver value, not just this is how I do my little piece of it.
Yeah, it makes sense. It's just that, yeah, and not the organization of the work that you need to do. If things aren't assigned to you, that would be a different way of.
Right.
It's a
And I'm not.
shock.
What'd
It's
you
a
say?
shock. It's a shock.
Well,
Oh my God.
let me I'm not trying to say that you shouldn't have stuff assigned to people. What I am trying to say though is you want team ownership of delivering those stories, not just, oh, that's Joe's job to deliver that story, I'm delivering this story. And one of the ways that should show up is if you're in a stand up and you're talking about how do we deliver value today, well, if you've got a story that's ready to could be actually delivered to the user, I should be very willing to stop working on what I'm working on to help deliver that, because that's the way we actually give value. Now, they may not need me, and that's fine. I'll work on whatever's over here. But it is that shift from the idea of, as a team, we deliver value to the user rather than I deliver the stories that are assigned to me.
Okay.
Yeah, and don't take the. I mean, don't go back and say, yeah, Mark said take all everybody's names off the stories. If you've got stuff that's working, don't just go tear it up. But the mentality behind that, I think, is important, of thinking about how do we work on things together. Is there a way for us to think of a story that's full slice to where I can work with someone else and we can deliver it, and we still feel like we got credit for it and everything, but we delivered something that was actually arranged from the standpoint of what's delivered to the user, rather than I did the front end and they did the back end, or vice versa.
Okay.
Yeah, we have a system where we have our task and we need to fill hours. Every hour of the day must be justified that we worked on that task or that task. And I think it's pretty difficult to say if you help someone else, you don't know where to put your time. So I'm not sure, sometimes it doesn't stop people from saying, okay, I will go work on something else because I will look bad because I will put 4 hours for a very simple task, or not know where to put my task. So maybe that is something
Well,
that doesn't help collaboration.
You can log your time on any story. It doesn't have to be yours.
Okay, so you have to ask the other developer what's the story and then log time on that story.
I don't know what the solution is. I find what Mark is saying really interesting, even though I mean, I've heard of these shops where you have just a lot of tickets and they go and pick per priority. I think there might be something there for us to explore. I mean, the rest, how Jira works and how we work today, it's technicality. The goal of delivering software should take precedence, and we adapt the tools to what we need to do.
And please do take everything I'm saying as I'm trying to give you ideas. What works best for you will be what you find works best for you. These are things that I found work really well for teams, a lot of teams. Your situation, though, may be a little bit different, and I would hate for you to go do it, say, hey, we're going to do just what Mark said here. The goal is to say, what are the areas that we want to improve, and what are some ideas of experiments we can try that may take a step forward to us? And if the experiment fails, that's fine. You learned something, go back and try something else. Or maybe that area you found out you have optimized the best you can. This is slightly related. There's a guy called Ryan Latta, I can't remember. Anyway, he did a lunch and learn with me here a while back, and he goes into a lot of. He used to work at. He may still be at ThoughtWorks, but he used to go in and he'd come in as a Scrum Master temporarily to help people get things headed. And he's a lot of fun to listen to, because he's like, people are all telling me what their status report is. And he's like, it's not for me, it's for the team. So people would be talking to him, everybody looking at him, giving him the status report, and he'd just do this. It just turned around, because he was like, I want to make sure that we sit, and they're like, why, and then they had to find somebody else to look at. But he made a good point that he would always start his stand-ups by saying, okay, what's our goal for this stand-up? Our goal is to make sure we coordinate today's work toward meeting the sprint goal. Now, not everybody's working. Sometimes you're working more with just a sequence of work than having a sprint goal. But I thought that was very telling, though, of making sure we're talking about what can we do today to make sure we're doing the most valuable thing possible for our customers, for our users. And just because we had a plan at the beginning of the sprint, if we're in a place right now where maybe things have changed, let's work to collaborate to go ahead and deliver the most value we possibly can, even if that looks different than it did, a week ago when we were talking about this, or 2 weeks ago, or whatever that is. And what I thought was so great about that is it gets the team focused on how the team is going to deliver instead of just how do I deliver my particular piece. And there's a lot of work in software engineering that's not just typing. And I think this is particularly true with the cloud, right? It's not a matter of how fast you can type, how well you can develop. It's how quickly can you solve these problems. And there's lots of places where if I work here on this thing and somebody else works here on this thing, we will deliver slower than if we both work together because of that. I'm not saying everything's like this, but there are situations like that because you know about this one piece in the cloud that I don't know about, and I know about this one piece of the cloud that you don't know about. And if we work on solving our problems together, we'll actually get our flow and deliver a lot more rapidly for that. And we've got to be careful to make sure that we're not assuming that we're more efficient separately, when most of what it is there's this vast pool of knowledge we need to know, and not all of us, no one knows all of it, and everybody has different facets that they understand. And sometimes that's it's useful to just make sure we're not having preconceived ideas that what we do is mostly typing and it's faster to type separately. Any other thoughts on this? It's a good discussion.
Yeah. One item I'm struggling with is you were talking about architecture earlier on and how you have this architecture team and this functionality team. It's something I'm experiencing. We can have one user story that has a lot of technical steps, and it's really difficult to, I find, to give it a thin slice to move to production. For example, we're working on MFA, so multi-factor authentication. You can define that as one story pretty easily, but as it turns out, implementation is a long multi-step process, touching a lot of different expertise.
Okay.
So that's one piece I'm struggling with. So I told my architects, you're all having Mark scores, so now you can do your own user stories. And I'm off the hook.
Okay. So with the multi-factor, because I mean that makes sense, right? That's something that is going to be hard no matter how you do it, because it's like a spider web, right? It touches everything. You might look for, is there any way to get part of it working for a segment of your users that touches fewer things? So you get that feedback, you take one step forward, and then you take the next step up involved in it. There may be, if you segment things, if you're willing to segment things, you may find ways to get like, well, here's the part that's easy. Let's do the easy part first. No, this only works for 5% of our users. This will only be turned on for them. But it gets us experience with it. Maybe these are users that are great people to try this stuff out with. And then we've got, the tendrils that run everywhere else that we'll deal with once we've got that level of experience with it.
Yeah, Claire will think about it.
So what's unclear is who will be using this, writing these user stories. It may be developers, it may be BAs, it may be architects. Anyone? How do you synchronize? Like, let's say I decide, I would split it in 10 stories. I guess it's still better to consult with BAs at least, or even.
Well, BAs bring the business requirements up front, but splitting them, I think, is a collaboration with developers. If developers see opportunities to split stories, I really don't mind that they write them. For me, it's a collaboration game. For your MFA project, Claire, I'm looking to you to write user stories.
Okay.
But
it's still, I guess I should also organize meetings to consult and stuff like that at the same time.
Of course.
Okay.
The knowledge for the optimal way to split things is probably distributed across lots and lots of different
Exactly.
Because you're talking about something that has lots of different aspects to it. And in any solution to ways to split that one person comes up with is going to be far inferior to something if you've got multiple people looking at it and making sure you're bringing all the different facets to bear in it. Okay, we've got about 2 minutes left. Anything else we want to cover before we go? Was this useful? Mostly useful? Interesting ideas?
Yes.
Very useful.
Very interesting.
Giuseppe, did you have a question? I thought I saw your hand go up, but it may have not been.
I was going to give a thumbs up and
Okay,
the other one.
that's cool.
Sylvain has a question.
I know, sorry, Robert. I did just like Giuseppe.
It's bad UX.
Yeah,
You
that's
think
what I
it's a thumbs up, but it's ask a question.
Cool. Okay, well, thank you all so much. I'll go ahead and close this meeting. I will also send a link to two cartoons on user stories and splitting user stories in case those are useful. They're a lot shorter than this, I think like 8 minutes, and also send a link to the video. They'll be up for about a week in case I think Lewis may have wanted that. So I'll get that to you guys later on today. But thank you all so much and have a great rest of your day.
Have a
Thank you
good
very
day.
much.
Very much.
Right, bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Much.